All right, so we're going to start working on analyzing poetry. I took the notes or the chapter 4 from the AP textbook and made these notes from that to kind of save you guys from having to read through it. We will do half today and half tomorrow as not to overwhelm. I want to remind you, you should be taking notes. You can do it in your own notebook, you can do it in Google Doc, whatever. But make sure you have these because we will be working with this material for at least the next 2 weeks. Some things to remember when analyzing poetry. Every word matters, which is why you should read a poem more than once in a sitting. I always recommend that you read a poem 3 times. Once just to digest it, the second time and start get a deeper understanding, trying to nitpick different parts of it, and then the last time really digging into the material. But we'll talk more about that as we go along. You must interpret not just what the poem means, but how that meaning is created. Now, this is the same when we analyze fiction, but poems can be kind of difficult because they're shorter, you have less to work with. In a lot of ways, they're more mysterious. And so you really have to take your time and dissect it layer by layer. This often involves analyzing the speaker's attitude toward an idea expressed in the poem. Think about why the person is writing what they're writing. So what was the catalyst? What made them sit down and write about this thing the way that they did? That will definitely help you pick apart poems. Steps to help you study a new poem. First, read a poem at its most literal level to form a basic understanding of it. This will help you discover the poem's main subject and provide the foundation for your analysis. So this is what I was telling you about reading the poem 3 times, right? Read the poem once just to get a feel for how it progresses. When we read novels, I know I've told you guys before you should try to read novels multiple times as well, but those are much longer. Poems are often not very long, although they can be somewhat lengthy, but you can typically read them multiple times in one sitting. There's a benefit to that because, as you know, when you read books, the more times that you read something, the deeper the understanding you have, and the more likely you are to actually be able to grasp the material and use it. Second step is locate the speaker of a poem, along with his or her attitude towards its subject. This will help form the basis of your interpretation of the poem's meaning. Before you can analyze what is being talked about or how it's being discussed, you need to know who the speaker is. And the third step is to read the poem for its stylistic details, demonstrating how each of the major poetic elements of style contributes to a poem's meaning. This last step is crucial. It connects style to meaning by providing evidence for your interpretation of the poem. No close analysis is complete without it. The rest of this PowerPoint, we're going to delve deeper into each of these 3 steps. And I'm going to give you specific rhetorical devices and specific things to do within each step to help you with your analysis. So step 1, reading for literal meaning. Before you can analyze a poem, you must identify its subject. Ask yourself, what is the poem about? One of the most effective ways to determine a poem's subject is to read it with an eye toward the literal meaning of the words on the page. So think literally the first time you read. So as you go through a poem, what is it literally telling you? Because if you don't understand the literal meaning, trying to understand the figurative meaning is going to be really difficult. So think, what are the ideas that are getting across? What are the words telling you? In order to identify the subject, you can use these questions. What is happening in the poem? What do you visualize as you read? What does it make you think about? And do you have an emotional reaction to it? If If you look at the image on the left, look at all these faces. Like as you read, you feel different things. You should mark down what you're feeling as you're reading. You should mark down what are you visualizing, what comes to mind. And in general, just what is going on. Because sometimes poems are, it's very easy to understand what's happening in them. Other times, you will read a poem twice and be like, what? What is going on? And that's fine. But you have to try to pick it apart chunk by chunk. Before you read a poem, consider the title. It may provide a useful clue about the poem's subject. Titles can be misleading, ironic, or indirect, so be careful not to jump to hasty conclusions. Just because something is entitled, Love of My Life, the speaker or the author may be playing on the idea, playing on the concept of somebody's, the love of their life, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that that is what the subject of this poem is. So be very careful. Now, sometimes it is the subject, but make sure that you are considering all the roads possible. Taking note of the title is just one of the many approaches to understand a poem and should happen alongside other reading strategies. It's just one of the things you're going to look at. You don't just look at the title of something and go, all right, moving on, I know what it's about. No, you're going to consider the title in relation to the rest of the piece. If you find that the poem is confusing or difficult to follow, it may be helpful to look for full sentences that extend past the line and stanza breaks. Those sentences may reveal a story. One of the things we're going to look at as we start to analyze specific poems is how many lines does a poem have, how many stanzas does a poem have, and how many sentences does a poem have, because those will not be the same number. For example, you can have a poem that has 3 stanzas and 12 lines, but there's only 3 sentences. That means that those 3 sentences are spread across a certain number of lines. Now, in order to track this, we look specifically at punctuation. And as we read our first poem, I'll show you. And that's actually one of the first things that I ask you to mark, because the punctuation is really important. By breaking a poem down into sentences, you can immediately identify its subject. I would say mostly. So hence the image on the left, you're going to break it down, right? Break it down into sentences because your sentences tell a different story, or can tell a different story. Step 2, consider the speaker. Once you've, identified the subject of the poem, the next step is to think about who the speaker is. Who is the one that is telling the story, or telling the lines, saying the lines, sorry. The poem speaker provides its voice. When we read a poem, we are viewing the world from the speaker's perspective. The speaker is literally the one that, if this was being read out loud, would be the person that's saying this. Now, it's really important to know that the speaker and the poet are not necessarily the same. So it might be tempting to jump to the conclusion that the speaker and the poet are the same, but most often the speaker is a persona or a character created by the poet. So think of like an out-of-body experience, right? It might be something that the poet feels at a specific time, or maybe like they're just pushing their feelings on some other thing, right? So even when the speaker is the poet, it's often the poet in a particular mood, with a particular purpose or attitude, telling a particular story at a particular time. So it's when all the stars align, so to speak. So every feeling, emotion, season, whatever, has to align at that particular moment to make that poem with that speaker. So jumping to the conclusion that, oh yeah, it's just the poet, well, be more specific. If you do think that it's possible that the poet and the speaker are the same, then describe the situation. So the speaker is under this condition. I do want to point out, when we write our analyzations and we're talking about what's being said, we are going to use the phrasing, the speaker. Okay? We're going to refer to the person delivering the lines as the speaker. We don't say the poet unless we're talking about the structure, like how something is written. Developing a clear idea of who the speaker is helps clarify his or her attitude towards the poem's subject. The connection you make between speaker and subject forms the basis of your interpretation of the poem's meaning. Before you begin to explore how the writer creates meaning, you must first develop your own idea of what meaning is. This is no different than every AP prompt we've done up until this point. Before you can say how something is done, you have to know what is done. You have to give meaning to a poem before you can say how the poet creates that meaning. It's really hard to say, if you think about like the last prompt, the third AP prompt, for example, it's really hard to say that the author establishes or uses, let's say uses the creature to show the harsh realities of man, right? To establish his purpose, if you don't know what the purpose is. It's the same sort of thing. So first, find the subject, find the speaker, and then develop your own idea of what meaning is. What is the meaning of this poem? And I'm going to forewarn you now. Some poems are more difficult than others. Again, you will read some poems that you have to read them several times to make meaning. And sometimes the meaning that you make and the meaning that, somebody else makes is not going to be the same. And you need to remind yourself that that is okay, as long as you can defend what you're saying with reasonable evidence. Now we're going to jump into more literary devices that go along with this step. So writers of poetry make conscious word choices depending on the connotations and denotations of the words that they use. So you guys should know what denotation and connotation are. So denotation, a word's explicit meaning; connotation, the association that a word carries. Together, these word choices work in concert to create diction. I would argue that in poetry, it is far more critical to analyze diction than in fiction. The reason why I say this is because poets, everybody strategically chooses words, but poets in particular, because they're working with such a short form, tend to play with the use of words much more in a shorter period of time than an author does in a novel, for example. So we will look at examples of like, okay, here's a word, and there are 3 different dictionary definitions of this word, and there's, a different connotation for it. Which version of the word is being used in this poem and why? I think one of the poets that stands out the most to me actually is Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, because he, writing in the Middle Ages, very much took advantage of the fact that this one word has multiple meanings, and he would use the word multiple times in his prose, but use it a different way each time. And it was up to the reader to decipher what is he trying to say. So poets do this quite often, and it can be quite fun to have debates over like, well, what is he actually saying, or what is she actually saying? All right, so this wraps up the first part of the notes. There will be a second link with more notes, so just look out for that URL, and I'll see you in a bit.